Dr. Kimberly Nix Behrens is the founder of Fit Learning and CEO of Fit Learning Online. She's a leading expert on the science of learning and its application to academic instruction. Dr. Behrens began developing the Fit Learning instructional method more than 2 decades ago. Since that time, her organization has transformed learning outcomes with thousands of students worldwide. Dr. Behrens is a frequent invited speaker, podcast guest, and contributor to popular press publications. She's the author of the critically acclaimed book, Blind Spots: Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. Dr. James McPartland is the Harris Professor of Child Psychiatry and Psychology at the Yale Child Study Center. He is a practicing licensed child psychologist and director of the Yale Developmental Disabilities Clinic and the Yale Center for Brain and Mind Health. Dr. McPartland has published 7 books and more than 200 scholarly works on autism and related topics. He has served on the executive boards of the International Society for Autism Research and the APA Division of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Autism Spectrum Disorder, and currently chairs the Scientific Advisory Board of the Autism Science Foundation. Samantha Owens is a seasoned educator dedicated to empowering learners with unique abilities. As a learning specialist at Beacon College, the nation's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating students with learning and attention issues, she leverages her expertise to support students on their academic journeys. Her diverse background includes teaching K-12 students in both traditional and specialized settings with a focus on exceptional student education. Owens has a passion for creating innovative learning experience as evidenced by her work in developing and implementing hands-on programs for individuals with autism. She is pursuing a PhD in higher education leadership from Capella University. And we're going to start our conversation with Dr. Behrens. What are some of the primary challenges neurodivergent children face when they are making the transition from elementary to middle school?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. You know, and this applies to all learners, not just neurodivergent ones, but the greatest challenge that I've, observed with kids transitioning to middle school is that many of them lack proficiency in core fundamental academic skills. And this is a function of the fact that school occurs, advancing kids grade to grade based on their age, rather than on true mastery of prerequisite skills required for higher level content. And so this issue applies to all learners, not just kids who are neurodivergent, but I see it as a greater problem for neurodivergent kids because they have actual neurological barriers to learning that make everything harder for them. And so when they are transitioned to middle school and they don't have the fundamental skills required to perform that grade level content, and they're receiving resource services or special services that aren't necessarily targeting past deficit skills, this makes everything dramatically more challenging for them. So it's really, it's a systemic issue with all kids, but it's very problematic for kids who are neurodivergent.
Thank you. So Dr. McPartland, what developmental changes, both cognitive and emotional, impact neurodivergent children's ability to make this transition successfully?
Well, there's a lot happening in development during this period of adolescence. It's hard for everybody. It's especially hard for neurodivergent children. When we think about cognition at this time, children are becoming able to form more sophisticated reasoning, abstract thought. They're able to logically process things in ways that they couldn't in the past. They're really starting to develop the cognitive tools that will be their human power in adulthood. But emotionally, there's a lot going on. They're not quite as refined. Puberty is happening. There's hormones surging through their body. They're becoming aware of really acutely aware in different ways than they had been previously about how similar they are or different they are from other kids. And so there's a lot of emotional lability and mood swings. And that's just for the neurotypical kids. If you take that context and think about it from the perspective of neurodivergence, these are kids who may have, more unique idiosyncratic profiles of cognitive strengths, and vulnerabilities that are also changing as kids compare themselves to one another more and more. These are kids who are going to find, objectively true ways that they're different from other kids. And so that's really, really challenging. So there's many unique challenges across cognition, across emotion that we see in the behavior, and we can also see in the brain development of neurodivergent kids during this time.
Thank you, Doctor. So Samantha, are there any specific academic or socio-emotional challenges that children who learn differently experience when they make that transition into middle school?
Yeah, so neurodivergent children, as they're entering middle school and throughout their time there, are going to face some pretty significant academic challenges as they adjust to things like an increased workload and more complex assignments as well. They're struggling in dealing with this on top of also having difficulties with executive functioning skills. They might, for the first time ever, have more than one class and more than one teacher, which requires strong time management and strong organizational skills. So those are areas academically that our students might need some more support in. And then socially and emotionally, middle school tends to be a time where students are exposed to some very new and unstructured social settings. So they're having to eat lunch for the first time ever in a large cafeteria, or they're working on group projects. And for students who already are struggling with social skills, these new situations might cause some misunderstandings, it might cause some isolation, and it might also negatively impact their self-esteem as well.
Thank you, Samantha. So Dr. Behrens, drilling further down into what Samantha was saying, in what ways does the increased academic rigor and expectations impact a neurodivergent child's self-esteem when they make this transition to middle school?
Well, and again, I'm gonna make this a blanket statement about all kids, but there's a misunderstanding out there in the world that self-esteem or confidence happens first, and that's what sets kids up to be successful in academics. And that's actually incorrect, because competence is what actually produces what you might call self-esteem or confidence. So knowing what you're expected to do and being able to execute that is what creates confidence for kids. And that could be in any area: music, athletics, and academics. So the big issue kids have when they transition to middle school is that they're still not proficient readers, and they are still disfluent in core math skills. They can't write well. Those things happen across the board with kids in the United States. And so when you have neurodivergent kids who are probably more behind than a neurotypical kid, that's going to make it even harder for a child to perform in the classroom, because they actually don't have the core skills required to complete that, to learn that grade level content. And the biggest problem with neurodivergence is kids have received a diagnosis or a label most of the time. And so that label or that diagnosis is used as the explanation for why the child is struggling. But that's not always the case, because all kids, again, need mastery of fundamental skills. And if they don't have that, then all kids struggle. And so the problem is when you kind of attribute a deficit to a diagnosis, rather than looking at a core skill set and identifying core skill deficits that can be fixed with effective instruction, then you're missing the opportunity to produce the kind of mastery that gives kids confidence because they are competent in the classroom. And again, this applies to all learners, not just kids with a diagnosis or a neurodivergent label.
Thank you. So Dr. McFarland, middle school introduces multiple teachers and rotating schedules. Does this throw a new monkey wrench into the executive functioning challenges neurodivergent children have?
I think monkey wrench is a good choice of words. I want to first just say what we mean when we say executive functions. So executive functions, we refer to the set of skills that the mental skills that we have that let us keep information in mind and manipulate it. I think of executive functions as kind of your brain's administrative assistant that lets itself keep itself on track. And it's a really common area of vulnerability in many, many forms of neurodivergence. Something, for example, is impact in autism, in ADHD. For example, for an anxious person, that's also going to have an impact on executive function. And so during this time, there are many changes that are happening in the academic environment that really tax executive function. class routines. You don't just show up and sit there and rotate topics. It's much less predictable and more complex. You've got to navigate physical space to get from class to class. You have to change from math, English while you're doing that. There's many, many more pieces of information to keep in mind. And the expectations are much higher. Teachers and parents and academic administrators are beginning to expect students to be more responsible and independent. We talked a moment ago about the cognitive and emotional challenges. So that's layered onto this. There's a lot that we're asking for kids who have trouble keeping all these things in line at once. But there's also, on the one hand, the demands are greater than ever, but the tools accessible to these children to do better are also stronger than ever. We all carry an administrative assistant in our pocket. And so we as educators, as parents, can help our kids learn to use these kinds of tools. Whether it's electronic or not, there's risks keeping this particular administrative assistant in your pocket, but teaching kids to use planners, to think about how to anticipate their day. The simplest instruction, like just thinking what your classes are going to be before you go to school in the morning, you take 5 minutes and make a big difference. So there are many challenges on executive function during this time, but there's also a lot of very straightforward things that we can do to help children feel prepared.
All right, thank you. So Samantha, in middle school, the social dynamics change, maybe close to Lord of the Flies in some respects, but how does this impact these children who are making this transition?
Yeah, that impact can be really significant. So the shift in dynamics during middle school can present not only some unique challenges, but it does luckily present some opportunities for growth as well. So middle school tends to be a time where students do start attaching more importance to building those peer relationships. And that can be hard for students who struggle with recognizing social cues and norms. And when they start to feel that pressure to conform, they might struggle even more and not be able to feel like they can build those connections. However, one good thing about middle school is that often for our students, this is a time where they're exposed to more peers and they're exposed to a wider range of peers. This gives them not only more opportunities to build social skills, but also to actually find people to make friends with. They have more opportunities to find peers that share experiences and might share interest as well. As mentioned before, middle school does tend to be a time where students start to recognize how they are different from their peers, whether this is something that they're recognizing on their own or they're recognizing because peers are pointing these things out. This can definitely lead to some feelings of maybe inadequacy. But again, the positive side to this is also a time where students start to build some resiliency and they start to build some self-advocacy skills as well.
So Dr. Behrens, in middle school, what role does peer exclusion and bullying play, and how can parents and educators help these children navigate these issues?
Yeah, so I mean, I've worked with a lot of kids who've experienced bullies, have been experienced bullying, have been victims of bullying. Actually, kids who are now not attending school because the school environment has become such a toxic place for them. So this is again, I keep saying this, but a systemic problem across the board with kids, not just kids who have neurodivergence, but those kids are obviously very easy targets because they do things differently. They don't blend in necessarily. So, I always say this, bullying is a learned behavior. Kids aren't born bullies, right? They're not born that way. That's a behavior that's learned and practiced over time. And it's obviously there's a payoff there somewhere because I'm a behavior scientist. So what we know is that behavior is a function of repeated reinforcement. And so there is some payoff for kids who engage in bullying. And most likely the payoff is attention from peers, especially in middle school when the peer group becomes a much more powerful source of reinforcement than the parents. That, parents are very powerful for kids when they're young, but when kids transition to middle school, the peer group becomes much more important. And so as educators and as parents, it is essential for us to, number one, from a very early age, ensure that we're teaching our kids how to engage in kind actions, kind behavior, or acceptance have kids practicing those skills over time, provide reinforcement for those kinds of behaviors, model those behaviors, give kids opportunities to practice them. And when kids do not engage in that kind of behavior, that requires immediate feedback. And punishment is not just the thing you want to do, and it's actually not the thing you want to do at all. What you want to do is, when you observe an unkind behavior, is provide feedback and then have the child practice doing an alternative kind of behavior instead, and practice that all the time. And this should be happening in schools by teachers and educators. It should be happening at home. And to be honest with you, if the peer group itself was trained to not really pay this off for kids, it wouldn't happen as often, because what happens is the peers reinforce it with laughter, with, whatever kinds of congratulatory behavior kids engage in when they witness bullying. That whole thing needs to shift, because it can't just be an educator providing punishment or sending a kid to the principal's office. That doesn't change behavior. So kids have to practice being kind and recognize what unkindness is, and practice doing alternatives instead. It really is it takes a village, man, and that's the case in schools with this kind of behavior.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. So, Dr. McPartland, I need you to help mom and dad here. What are some early warning signs that they should be looking for that their child is not making a successful transition to middle school?
It's really complex, because it's not like there's just one warning sign. And certainly warning signs are going to vary from child to child, but even within a child, there could be lots of different kinds of things. It might manifest as losing interest in school. It might be a child who's talking about feeling anxious. You might see your child being more irritable, seeing differences in their academic performance, or failure to complete homework, doing more poorly on tests, reporting physical symptoms like headaches or nausea, things like that. The problem is that we've talked a little bit before, some of these changes are also just a typical part of adolescence. And so how do you determine whether this is an indicator of a problem, or you've just got a moody, sleepy teenager, which can also happen? And the advice I give to parents is to trust your judgment and to know your child. And if you have a sense that your child seems like they're acting different, well, that's relevant, and you should trust your judgment and try to engage. One of the problems is that it's really hard to engage when a child is already feeling these difficulties. And so what we can do as parents is really be proactive and try to create channels for communication in advance. This can look many different ways in different families and for different children. I mean, the point is just to listen and to provide opportunities to communicate and to receive your children's experience in a non-judgmental way. This might be car rides, dinner conversations, walking the dog together. The idea is just that there are times that you have built into your relationship with your child for these kinds of conversations, your questions, their overtures to happen naturalistically. But it's a challenge, in that it can manifest in many different ways, and many kids don't want to just kind of bring this up with their parents, especially once they're already feeling not so great.
Thank you, Doctor. So, Samantha, I want to transport you back into the classroom setting where you taught for many years. How can parents effectively communicate with educators about their child's unique needs during this transition period?
So as it was just mentioned, parents know their children best. And so as a former educator in K through 12 setting, I always really appreciated any time a parent would reach out with, a piece of insight on a strength of their child, or something that their child really enjoys, and would help me make that connection with their child. So effective communication with educators should be started early. It should be very thorough as well. Any information parents can provide about strengths, challenges, strategies that have worked in the past, specific examples of teaching methods maybe that were really effective before, or what your child really likes to engage in. Any of that is going to be really helpful for educators. It's also important that this communication is done regularly. Being done regularly is going to make sure that needs and concerns that arise are being addressed proactively, and that parents are also able to really monitor progress. And then one of probably the most important things is that by communicating effectively and thoroughly and regularly, parents are really helping to build a positive relationship with educators, because it's really a partnership. Everybody involved is really wanting to do what's best for the student, and effective communication allows that to happen.
All right, thank you. So, Dr. Behrens, let's get down to brass tacks here. I'm a parent, and I have a child that's about to make the transition next year to middle school. Rather than waiting to that moment that he's there, what can I do in advance to prepare him for the changes that are going to come in middle school?
Right. So again, my area of focus is academics. And that's, to be honest with you, that's the source of a lot of devastation for parents and their kids in that transition, because it's number one, the expectations increase, as has been mentioned by the other panelists, when kids enter middle school. But the problem with that is expectations increase, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a child has mastered the core academic skills required to meet those expectations. And so middle school can become a very punitive environment when a kid can't learn grade level content and accesses poor grades and, is constantly kind of failing to be able to access any kind of positive reinforcement in the classroom or in the school environment. So, it's really important for parents, and I wouldn't wait until the year before they go to middle school. I mean, I would make sure that parents are staying on top of how are my kids' fundamental academic skills, because kids start struggling in kindergarten and that doesn't fix itself. So if your child has been struggling with reading, struggling with mathematics, struggling with any kind of written assignment, handwriting, those are the things that start to become profoundly devastating for middle school kids, because there's no teaching to read anymore. There's no teaching core math anymore. It is the expectation that you're going to follow the timeline set by the district about all the content that you're expected to learn. And if you don't learn it, well, then you're going to fail, and the teacher's going to have to move on anyway. And so it becomes a real crisis in the middle school. A majority of my kids enrolled at FIT are middle school kids, because they've been pushed along for years in primary school, and then suddenly in middle school, everything changes and the expectations increase, but they still haven't had the opportunity to master core reading, math, writing, thinking skills. So being aware, is my child taking a really long time to read? Do they guess words? Are they struggling to decode? Can they not decode words? Do they not understand what they're reading? Does it take them forever to finish homework? Is there tantruming, crying, fits during homework? Those are all red flags that your child needs some intensive academic intervention to prepare them to be independent and successful when they transition to middle school and high school. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of core skill mastery, core academic skill mastery, and it's overlooked in our current education system because it's all about content and not about practice to mastery of fundamentals.
Thank you. So Dr. McPartlin, how can we teach children who learn differently to self-advocate as they take on more independence in middle school?
This is so important because self-advocacy is the tool that lets kids take care of themselves when there's not someone else around. That said, I want to emphasize that to be a self-advocate doesn't mean that you're operating in a vacuum or that you're entirely independent. And these are still kids, and their brains aren't fully cooked, and they don't have much of the experience and wisdom that they'll have, when they're the age of their parents or their teachers. So I think a really important first step is helping children recognize that they have allies, that people have their back, that the teacher isn't just the person sitting up there looking stern who's going to administer a test. The teacher is there because they want to help you learn. That parents aren't just the people who are going to frown if you didn't get an A. Parents are there because they're your strongest advocate of all. So I think the first thing to remember is that you have these people that can be sources of advice that you can go to plan to self-advocate. And then I think it's teaching children to communicate. When you conceptualize a teacher in this way, you can approach a discussion with the teacher in a really different way than if you see them as just kind of a test administrator. Parents can support children's self-advocating by helping to identify issues that they should be advocating for boundaries too. Children won't have the best judgment about what they should or should not be entitled to. And then helping children practice or even role-playing how they might do these kinds of things with people in the schools or in other settings. It can also be helpful to find someone who isn't a parent, who is somewhere in between, like an older sibling, a cousin, even a kid in the neighborhood that's just a little older. Sometimes children are able to hear lessons from these kind of more mature peers in a way that they're not willing to hear them from parents. Another thing that I think that can be helpful is for parents to talk about their own experiences, almost to think out loud, so that when a parent is struggling with an issue at work or in their own social life and is trying to think about how to, in this instance, advocate for themselves, just talking out loud about your thought process and what you tried and what worked and what didn't work and how it helped you either practically or emotionally can be a really, really good example for children. And lastly, helping children be aware of their strengths and vulnerabilities, I think, is also a really, their strengths really is really an important asset for self-advocating, because when you understand what you're good at, you're in a much better position to work with people to try to build your world around those things and to use it to compensate for the things that really challenge you. So many, many different strategies, but not one thing for everybody.
Thank you, Doctor. So Samantha, we're well into our first year in middle school. What are some signs that the transition is going well? And how can parents help make sure that the child experiences continued success?
So it was mentioned earlier that there are some signs for like an unsuccessful transition, but it is going to vary depending on the student. And that's true for a successful transition as well. Not every student's going to have the same signs of a successful transition, but you might see things like a willingness or even an eagerness to go to school. The students participating in class and participating in class activities. Maybe they've started developing some social connections with their peers or are maintaining social connections with their peers. All of those things would be some good signs of a positive and successful transition. Academically, you might see that their performance is meeting their potential, that they are able to maybe track or monitor their assignments with or without some assistance. But those would be some positive signs that they're transitioning successfully. Emotional regulation might also improve. So students might be really anxious about that transition to middle school. But maybe as they start to transition successfully into middle school, maybe you start to see a decrease in meltdowns or a decrease in anxiety related to going to school. And then the second part of that question, so how can parents continue to support students and make sure that support is provided? Well, one of the biggest things is communication. So making sure that there are lines of communication between yourself as a parent and your child. So having conversations about what went really well that day, what are they doing really well at, and then praising and providing reinforcement and encouragement for those things. And then having conversations about what maybe they're struggling with and helping them to overcome those things or to build some skills that they need to overcome those challenges. And then finally, working with your student on building some skills that they need to be successful in middle school and beyond. So teaching them problem solving skills and working them through maybe some different scenarios and how to resolve conflicts that they're having in school, teaching them how to self-advocate, and then just really teaching them to be proud of themselves and to have confidence in their abilities as well.
All right, that's going to be our final word today. Dr. Kimberly Behrens, Dr. James McPartland, and Samantha Owens. Thanks for the knowledge.